It's fascinating to me to read the Gospels and see Jesus literally running to crowds. And then in another chapter, it's saying that the crowds were coming to him, and he looked at them and told his disciples, let's go. I'm leaving. Why would he do that? Because he saw the motive heading towards him. Because he could hear the sounds. He walked in perfection. That's what God's getting you to. Not to become familiar with the world's way. The world says, oh, success is crowds. The success, look at God's blessed. Look at how many people showed up. And yet Jesus is running from it. This is what our minds are capable of doing. If you conform to the world, you set up a worldly system within the house of God, you're going to think that what the world says is a success is what you are being successful with God. It was Jesus who listened to the Holy Spirit when he came upon sick and blind people and was moved with compassion to heal them. He would stop dead in his tracks because of the movement of the Holy Spirit unctionizing in that spontaneous moment. You don't know you're going to the grocery because you need groceries. So while you're there, the Holy Spirit, you got to walk into these places, say, if you need to use me, I'm available. Because he will. It was also Jesus who listened to the Holy Spirit. You cannot compromise the integrity of the work of the Holy Spirit's spontaneity. Your job is to uphold the integrity of the perfection in the spontaneity. Preserve it. It was also Jesus who listened to the Holy Spirit when he was disciplined Peter by telling him his mind was not right. Jesus spoke to the Spirit that Peter allowed to use him. If your mind comes into agreement with a hellish thought, hell now has authority. So Jesus addressed it. Peter said, God forbid it, when it was God's will that Jesus was speaking. So Jesus says, get behind me, Satan. You're not fooling me. And then he tells Peter, your mind is on the things of man, Peter. God forbid it did not come from the Lord. That came from a spirit that originated in your thoughts. Because instead of coming into agreement with the Lord, you let yourself start to dissect it and your logic. No, I can't. God, you can't die. That was fear. Because the Holy Spirit never feeds hell. So whatever you allow those thoughts, emotions, desires, motives to flow from will determine what source you are willing to respond outwardly to. The process of heaven is that God speaks and you receive it. Get ready to receive it. Get your heart ready. So the areas of your mind have to be prepared to take it all in, to receive it so that your heart receives it, because that's where the issues of life flow from, the distribution process. So whatever you allow those thoughts, emotions, desires, motives to flow from, whatever you allow them to flow from, whatever area, whether it's self or hell or God, whatever you're allowing it to flow from will determine what source you are willing to respond outwardly to, or you are using to respond outwardly to. It will either flow from the river of life or it will flow from self and hell, and both can't have a say at the same time. It's never half and half. You don't get to say, well, God said to do this, but I kind of perfected. We allowed this. No, you totally stepped out of God's will. That's not God and you. That's you took what was already perfected and decided to do other things. You chose, like Uzzah, to touch the ark. You chose to touch something that you had no business touching. God's glory is already perfect. So it will either flow from the river of life or it will flow from self. And both cannot have a say at the same time. Both cannot be applied. You cannot have two masters. but it will affect the development of your habits and your routines and your impulses. Because if your habits aren't to do what God told Ezekiel, receive it, not to listen to him and then be obedient in him, you're developing habits and routines that aren't in the flow of the Holy Spirit, that aren't what Ezekiel saw in chapter 1. He moves, you move. You're flowing in, he moves. Well, I did step 1 and 2, but I took it to step 3 and 4 on my own. I got it. Who you are around can affect this process. So the constant surrendering, the constant acts of obedience denies yourself the ability to fluctuate in and out of circumstances that depend on who you are around. So who you are around can affect the process. The need for the constant surrendering is there because these constant acts of obedience that you must deny yourself in to become familiar with God, to perfect the work, you'll be able to move in it perfectly. If not, you're going to fluctuate in and out of circumstances, and depending on who you're around will result in the outcome. You'll be moved by other people's impulses rather than the impulses of the Holy Spirit. If you catch yourself doing it, it's because you've entertained some kind of thought of either self or hell that's illuminating from that individual. Ezekiel was taken from his heart receiving it to his ears then being in tune with the sounds of it. The sounds filling Ezekiel is what filled him to properly equip him in his assignment. So the sounds he heard was because he first, in his heart, heard the words of God, and his mind and his heart came into agreement with it. So the unity of God flowing freely within Ezekiel, being one with God. What God was feeling and seeing, it came out in those sounds, and it filled up within Ezekiel. This is the process of the kingdom of heaven you're learning to walk through every day, so that when you are led by the Spirit to go in obedience, you are filled with the perfection of God. The glory of God to complete it in the emotions of heaven. Because heaven has emotions. God has emotions. Ezekiel had to bear the weight of embitterment and rage. Think about that. What was placed in him, what the surrendering of his heart and the surrendering of his ears did, is allow God, he surrendered to God, allowing him to bear a certain weight, a measure of what he was getting ready to walk in. He was carrying the weight of the embitterment, carrying the weight to a measure that God allowed him of the rage that God had over his people being disobedient. Ezekiel felt what the Holy Spirit carried from God right to him, so that he could then take it and share it to a nation, a people. You are bearing a weight to the measure that God allows of what he's doing, even in the emotions. You move because the Holy Spirit unctionized you. You move because you heard a sound of heaven. You move because the Spirit is moving in a particular direction, and you will be fully equipped in the process.